On a clear morning in June 1984, the small town of Castle Rock, Colorado, was settling into the rhythm of summer. The air was warm, the kind of dry heat that brings people outdoors early before the afternoon sun becomes unbearable. For most families in this close-knit community south of Denver, it was just another ordinary day. Parents were heading to work, children were already plotting their summer adventures, and the Douglas County landscape stretched out in every direction with a quiet beauty that made people feel safe. But by nightfall, that sense of safety would be shattered. Two young women, sisters who had their entire lives ahead of them, would be found dead in a way that no one in Castle Rock could have imagined. And the person responsible would walk free for 26 years, living among the same people who mourned those girls, attending the same churches, shopping at the same stores, existing in plain sight while a terrible secret remained buried. What finally brought that secret to light wasn't advanced technology or a dramatic courtroom revelation. It was something far more human, far more fragile, and far more devastating to everyone who thought they knew the truth. Before I reveal how a single conversation in 2010 unraveled decades of silence and exposed a killer who had hidden behind respectability and family ties, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. These stories are told to make sure the truth doesn't disappear with time. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these stories reach. The victims were Barbara Miller and Susan Miller. Barbara was 20 years old, studying nursing at a community college in Denver and working part-time at a local pharmacy. Susan was 17, just weeks away from starting her senior year of high school. She was a cheerleader, popular among her classmates, known for her quick laugh and her habit of writing poetry in spiral notebooks she kept in her bedroom. The two sisters were close in the way that siblings often are when they're near in age. They shared clothes, shared secrets, fought over bathroom time, and protected each other fiercely when it mattered. Their parents, Richard and Joyce Miller, had raised them in a modest ranch-style home on the east side of Castle Rock, a neighborhood where people knew each other's names and left their doors unlocked at night. On the morning of June 14th, Barbara had the day off from work and Susan had no plans other than meeting a friend later that evening. Their mother left for her job at the county clerk's office around 8:30. Their father, who worked construction, had already been gone since before dawn. The plan was simple. The girls would have the house to themselves, maybe watch television, maybe drive into town for lunch. It was the kind of unremarkable summer day that no one thinks to remember, because nothing about it seems worth holding on to. Except that neither Barbara nor Susan would be seen alive again after noon. When Joyce Miller returned home that evening around 6 o'clock, she noticed immediately that something was wrong. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual, but the house was too quiet. She called out for her daughters. No response. She walked through the living room, the kitchen, down the hallway toward the bedrooms. Barbara's purse was on the kitchen counter. Susan's car keys were on the table by the door. Joyce felt her chest tighten. She opened the door to Susan's bedroom first. Empty. Then Barbara's room. Also empty. But when she reached the small bathroom at the end of the hall, the door was closed. She knocked. Nothing. She turned the handle. What she found inside that bathroom would become the central image of a nightmare that lasted more than 2 decades. Barbara and Susan were both there, their bodies positioned in a way that made it clear this was not an accident, not a medical emergency, not something that could be explained away. They had been killed. The scene suggested violence, control, and an intimacy that pointed to someone who had been inside that house before. Someone who knew the layout. Someone who knew the family. Joyce screamed. She ran to the phone and called the police, her voice barely coherent. Within minutes, patrol officers from the Castle Rock Police Department arrived. Within an hour, detectives from the Douglas County Sheriff's Office were processing the scene. By midnight, the entire town knew that something unspeakable had happened to the Miller sisters. The investigation began immediately, but it also began with assumptions. In 1984, forensic science was not what it would become in later decades. DNA profiling was still being developed in research labs and wouldn't be used in American criminal cases for several more years. What detectives had to rely on were witness statements, physical evidence like fingerprints and fibers, and the ability to read people. They interviewed neighbors. They interviewed friends. They interviewed anyone who had been near the Miller home that day. And very quickly, a theory began to form. The theory was this: someone had broken into the house while the girls were home alone. Someone who either knew they would be there or who saw an opportunity and took it. The lack of forced entry suggested the person had been let inside, which meant the girls likely knew their killer. Detectives began compiling a list of everyone in the sisters' social circles. Boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, classmates, co-workers, family friends. The list grew long. The investigation grew complicated. One name that appeared early in the process was Michael Patton, a 31-year-old man who lived 3 streets away from the Miller family. Patton was known in the neighborhood as a quiet, somewhat awkward figure who worked at a hardware store in town and kept to himself. He had no criminal record. He had no obvious connection to Barbara or Susan. But a neighbor mentioned seeing him walking near the Miller house on the morning of the 14th, and that was enough for detectives to bring him in for questioning. Patton was cooperative. He answered every question calmly, without hesitation. He said he had been home alone that day, doing yard work, and had taken a walk around the neighborhood in the late morning. He admitted he had walked past the Miller house but insisted he hadn't stopped, hadn't seen anyone, hadn't done anything unusual. When asked if he knew the Miller sisters, he said he recognized them from around town but had never spoken to them. He agreed to provide fingerprints. He agreed to let officers search his home. Nothing suspicious was found. No blood, no stolen items, no evidence that connected him to the crime scene. After 2 days of scrutiny, detectives let him go. Michael Patton was ruled out as a suspect. The investigation continued, but leads began to dry up. Weeks became months. Months became a year. The case file grew thick with notes, photographs, and dead ends. Detectives followed every possible thread. They re-interviewed witnesses. They submitted evidence for analysis and waited weeks for results that offered no breakthroughs. The Miller family held vigils, placed flowers at the gravesite, and waited for answers that never came. The town of Castle Rock tried to return to normal, but the unease lingered. Parents kept closer watch on their children. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted at night. And slowly, as years passed, the case began to fade from active investigation into the realm of cold files and unresolved questions. By 1990, the Miller case was no longer a priority for the Douglas County Sheriff's Office. It wasn't that detectives had given up. It was simply that without new leads, without witnesses coming forward, without physical evidence that could point definitively to a suspect, there was nowhere left to go. The case remained officially open, but in practical terms, it had gone cold. Barbara and Susan Miller became statistics. 2 more names in a growing list of unsolved homicides from the 1980s, a decade when violent crime was rising across the country and law enforcement resources were stretched thin. Richard and Joyce Miller never stopped asking questions. They called the sheriff's office regularly, sometimes once a month, sometimes more often. They wanted to know if anyone had looked at the case recently. They wanted to know if there were new detectives who might bring fresh eyes to the evidence. For the most part, the answers they received were polite but discouraging. The case was still open. If new information came to light, it would be investigated. But without something new, there was little anyone could do. Joyce, in particular, struggled with the idea that her daughter's killer was still out there, possibly still living in Castle Rock, possibly walking past her in the grocery store or sitting near her in church. She started keeping a journal where she wrote down her thoughts, her theories, her memories of Barbara and Susan. She wrote about how Susan had wanted to study literature in college, how Barbara had dreamed of becoming a nurse who worked with children. She wrote about the last time she saw them alive, how ordinary that morning had been, how she had kissed them both on the forehead before leaving for work. The journal became a way to keep their memories alive, but it also became a record of frustration and grief that never seemed to ease. Richard threw himself into his work. He didn't talk much about the case, didn't attend support groups or vigils after the first few years. His way of coping was to stay busy, to avoid sitting still long enough for the pain to catch up with him. But those who knew him well said he was never the same after June 1984. He aged faster. He became quieter. He stopped smiling the way he used to. The town itself began to forget, not because people didn't care, but because memory is fragile and time moves forward whether anyone wants it to or not. By the mid-1990s, new families had moved into Castle Rock. The population was growing as Denver expanded southward, and many of the newer residents had never heard of Barbara and Susan Miller. The case that had once dominated local news had become a whisper, a tragic story that older residents might mention in passing but that no longer shaped daily life. Michael Patton, the man who had briefly been questioned and then cleared in 1984, continued living in Castle Rock. He kept his job at the hardware store for several more years before moving to a different position at a local landscaping company. He married in 1989, a woman named Ellen who worked as a receptionist at a dental office. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and bought a small house not far from where Patton had lived during the time of the murders. To anyone who knew him, Michael Patton seemed like an ordinary man living an ordinary life. He went to work, came home, attended his kids' school events, mowed his lawn on weekends. He was polite to neighbors, never caused trouble, never drew attention to himself. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that Michael Patton carried a secret that weighed on him in ways that only became visible much later, in small moments that most people wouldn't have noticed or thought to question. The years between 1984 and 2010 are not empty space in this story. They are the years during which Barbara and Susan Miller existed only as memory. They are the years during which their parents aged without answers, during which their case file collected dust in a storage room at the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, during which the person responsible for their deaths lived a life that seemed normal on the surface but was built on a foundation of silence and fear. In 2003, Joyce Miller was diagnosed with cancer. She fought it for 2 years, underwent chemotherapy, lost her hair, lost weight, but never lost her determination to see justice for her daughters. She spoke to detectives one last time in early 2005, calling from her hospital bed to ask if there had been any progress. The detective who answered her call was kind but honest. There had been no new developments. The case was still open, but unless something changed, it was unlikely to be solved. Joyce died in March 2005. Richard was left alone with his grief and his unanswered questions. He stopped calling the sheriff's office after that. He stopped hoping, or at least he stopped expressing hope out loud. He lived quietly, saw his remaining family occasionally, and waited for his own life to end. But something did change. It didn't happen in a forensic lab or a courtroom or a detective's office. It happened in a conversation between 2 people, one of whom had been carrying a terrible burden for more than 2 decades. In early 2010, Michael Patton's marriage began to fall apart. The reasons were complicated, as they always are, but the underlying issue was something Ellen Patton had sensed for years without being able to name. Her husband was distant. He had nightmares. He drank more than he used to. He would sometimes sit in the garage late at night, staring at nothing, and when she asked him what was wrong, he would say he was fine. But he wasn't fine, and Ellen knew it. In February 2010, during an argument that started over something mundane and escalated into something much larger, Ellen confronted Michael directly. She told him she couldn't live with someone who shut her out, someone who seemed to be hiding something so deep that it poisoned everything around him. She said she wanted the truth, whatever it was, because living with his silence was worse than anything he could tell her. And in that moment, Michael Patton broke. He told her what he had done in June 1984. He told her about going to the Miller house that morning, about Barbara answering the door, about the conversation that had started normally and then escalated into something he couldn't control. He told her about Susan coming into the room, about the panic that set in, about the choices he made in a span of minutes that destroyed 2 lives and his own. He told her he had been living with it every day for 26 years, that it had eaten away at him slowly, that he didn't know how to carry it anymore. Ellen was horrified. She was also terrified. She didn't know what to do with this information, whether to believe it, whether to call the police, whether to protect her children from the reality of who their father was. She asked Michael why he was telling her now, after all this time. He said because he couldn't keep it inside anymore. He said he was tired of pretending. Ellen made a choice. She went to the Douglas County Sheriff's Office the next day. She told them everything Michael had said. She gave them dates, details, the exact words he had used. She told them she believed him because of the way he had said it, the way he had looked at her, the way he had seemed almost relieved to finally say it out loud. Detectives moved quickly. They pulled the old case file, reviewed the evidence, cross-referenced Ellen Patton's account with what they already knew. Michael Patton had been questioned in 1984 and cleared, but he had never been eliminated as a suspect in any definitive sense. There simply hadn't been enough evidence to charge him. Now, with a confession relayed through his wife, they had a reason to bring him in again. On March 12, 2010, detectives arrested Michael Patton at his workplace. He didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer immediately. He seemed almost calm, as though he had been expecting this moment for years. He was taken to the Douglas County Sheriff's Office and placed in an interrogation room. Detectives read him his rights and began asking questions. At first, Patton denied everything. He said his wife had misunderstood him, that he had been speaking hypothetically, that he had never confessed to anything. But as the interview continued, as detectives pressed him on specific details that only someone present at the crime scene would know, his story began to shift. He admitted he had been at the Miller house that day. He admitted he had spoken to Barbara. He admitted things had gone wrong. Over the course of several hours, Michael Patton gave a full confession. He explained that he had been attracted to Barbara Miller for months, that he had seen her around town and convinced himself that she was interested in him even though they had barely spoken. On the morning of June 14, 1984, he had walked to her house on impulse, thinking he would talk to her, maybe ask her out. When Barbara answered the door, she had been polite but confused. She didn't know who he was. When he tried to explain, tried to tell her he wanted to spend time with her, she became uncomfortable and tried to close the door. He pushed his way inside. Susan came into the hallway to see what was happening. Patton panicked. He couldn't let them call the police. He couldn't let them tell anyone he had been there. What happened next, he said, was a blur. He remembered Susan screaming. He remembered Barbara trying to protect her sister. He remembered making choices in a state of terror and rage that he couldn't fully explain even 26 years later. When it was over, he left through the back door, walked home through an alley, and waited to see if anyone would come for him. When detectives questioned him 2 days later, he lied. He told himself that if he could just stay calm, if he could just act normal, no one would ever know. And for 26 years, that strategy had worked. The confession was recorded. It was detailed. It was legally admissible. Michael Patton was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was held without bail. The news spread through Castle Rock within hours, and the reaction was one of shock, disbelief, and anger. People who had known Patton for decades, who had worked alongside him, who had trusted him, struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the person described in news reports. Richard Miller, who was 78 years old by then, received a phone call from a detective informing him of the arrest. He didn't say much in response. He thanked the detective. He hung up the phone. And then he sat in his living room for a long time, staring at photographs of Barbara and Susan, trying to feel something other than exhaustion. The legal process that followed was not dramatic. Michael Patton's defense attorney advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a sentence that would avoid the possibility of the death penalty. Patton agreed. In November 2010, he stood before a judge in Douglas County and formally pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. There was no trial. There were no witnesses called to testify. There was only a quiet courtroom, a grieving father, and a man who had finally stopped running from what he had done. During the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor read a statement on behalf of Richard Miller. It described the 26 years of not knowing, the phone calls that went unanswered, the hope that faded a little more with each passing year. It described what it meant to lose 2 daughters in a single day and then to lose the chance for justice for more than 2 decades. It described the pain of watching Joyce die without ever knowing the truth. The statement ended with a simple sentence: Barbara and Susan deserved better than this. They deserved better than him. Michael Patton was given the opportunity to speak. He stood, his hands shaking, and said he was sorry. He said he thought about Barbara and Susan every day, that he wished he could undo what he had done, that he knew no apology would ever be enough. His voice cracked. He sat back down. The judge sentenced him and the hearing ended. Richard Miller left the courthouse without speaking to reporters. He went home. He placed 2 framed photographs of his daughters on the mantel and sat in his chair by the window. He didn't feel relieved. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. But there was also something else, something smaller and harder to name. He knew the truth now. He knew who had taken his daughters from him and why. And in a world that had offered him nothing but silence for 26 years, that knowledge was something. It wasn't everything. But it was something. As you're listening to this, I'm curious, what time is it where you are right now? The resolution of the Miller case did not bring closure in the way that word is often used. Richard Miller did not suddenly find peace. The town of Castle Rock did not collectively exhale and move on. What happened instead was quieter and more complicated. People had to sit with the reality that someone they had known, someone they had trusted to be normal and harmless, had been responsible for a terrible crime. They had to ask themselves what they had missed, what signs they might have ignored, what it meant that evil could exist so close to home without anyone noticing. Ellen Patton and her children left Colorado shortly after Michael's sentencing. They changed their names. They tried to build new lives far away from the place where their family name had become synonymous with horror. Ellen gave one interview to a local newspaper in which she said she still didn't fully understand why her husband had told her the truth after so many years. She said part of her wished he had never said anything, because then she could have kept living in ignorance. But another part of her, the part that believed in accountability and truth, knew that she had done the right thing by going to the police. She said she thought about Barbara and Susan Miller often, and she hoped their father could find some measure of peace now that the person responsible was behind bars. In the years since Michael Patton's arrest, the Miller case has occasionally been referenced in discussions about cold cases and the limits of forensic science. It is held up as an example of how human factors, guilt, conscience, relationship breakdowns, and the simple inability to carry a secret forever, can sometimes solve cases that technology cannot. The confession did not come from DNA evidence, though investigators did later confirm that biological evidence from the crime scene matched Patton's DNA profile, adding scientific corroboration to what he had already admitted. The confession came because a man reached a breaking point and told his wife the truth, and his wife made the difficult choice to act on that truth. There are people who argue that 26 years is too long, that justice delayed is justice denied, that Barbara and Susan deserved answers much sooner than they received them. Those arguments are not wrong. There is something fundamentally unjust about a system that allows someone to live freely for more than 2 decades while the families of their victims suffer without resolution. But there is also something worth recognizing in the fact that the truth, however late, eventually emerged. Michael Patton was held accountable. His name is now permanently associated with the crime he committed. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. That outcome, imperfect as it may be, is more than many families of cold case victims ever receive. Richard Miller died in 2014 at the age of 82. He spent his final years in the same house where he had raised Barbara and Susan, surrounded by their photographs and the memories of a life that had been irrevocably changed by violence. In his obituary, his family requested that in lieu of flowers, donations be made to organizations that support victims' families and fund cold case investigations. They wrote that Richard had lived his entire life with dignity and strength, and that he had never stopped loving his daughters or fighting for them, even when the fight seemed hopeless. The case of Barbara and Susan Miller is not a story with a clean ending. It is not a story where good triumphs over evil in a satisfying or heroic way. It is a story about the long, grinding weight of loss and the slow, uncertain process of seeking justice in a world that does not always provide it. It is a story about how time can bury truth but cannot erase it entirely. And it is a story about the fragility of safety, the danger of assumptions, and the reality that monsters do not always look like monsters. What no one in Castle Rock could have known in June 1984 was that the person responsible for killing Barbara and Susan Miller would live among them for another 26 years, undetected and unsuspected, until his own conscience and the collapse of his marriage forced the truth into the open. What no one could have predicted was that justice would come not from forensic breakthroughs or investigative brilliance, but from a conversation between a husband and wife in a moment of raw honesty. If you believe Barbara and Susan deserved someone to keep pushing for the truth, hit that subscribe button. These stories are told because the people in them mattered. Their lives mattered. Their deaths mattered. And the search for answers, no matter how long it takes, matters too. There are broader questions raised by this case that extend beyond the specifics of what happened in Castle Rock. One of those questions is about how we understand guilt and secrecy. Michael Patton lived with what he had done for 26 years. During that time, he worked, married, raised children, and participated in a community that had no idea who he really was. His wife described him as distant and troubled, someone who drank too much and had nightmares, but those behaviors could have been attributed to any number of causes. Depression, stress, unresolved trauma from something unrelated. It wasn't until he explicitly confessed that anyone knew the real reason for his suffering. This raises the question of whether guilt is punishment in itself. Some would argue that Michael Patton's sleepless nights, his emotional distance, his inability to fully engage with his own life, constituted a kind of internal prison. Others would argue that emotional suffering, no matter how severe, is not justice. Barbara and Susan Miller did not get to have sleepless nights or troubled marriages or any kind of life at all. They were robbed of their futures. The fact that their killer suffered internally does not balance the scales. There is also the question of what it means to live next to violence without knowing it. The neighbors who waved to Michael Patton as he mowed his lawn, the co-workers who ate lunch with him, the parents whose children played with his children, all of them were going about their lives within close proximity to someone who had committed an unthinkable act. This is not unique to Castle Rock. It happens everywhere. People who commit terrible crimes do not always look dangerous or behave suspiciously. They blend in. They function. They exist alongside everyone else, and most of the time, no one knows. This reality is unsettling because it challenges the idea that we can identify threats based on appearance or demeanor. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the world is not as transparent as we would like it to be, and that the people we think we know may be hiding things we cannot imagine. Another question the case raises is about the role of family members who discover the truth about someone they love. Ellen Patton made a choice that destroyed her marriage and upended her children's lives. She could have stayed silent. She could have convinced herself that her husband had been speaking in hypotheticals or exaggerating or lying for reasons she didn't understand. She could have protected her family from the consequences of going to the police. But she didn't. She chose to prioritize truth and accountability over personal comfort and familial loyalty. That choice came at enormous personal cost, but it also made justice possible. It is worth asking what most people would do in that situation. If someone you loved confessed to something horrific, would you report them? Would you protect them? Would you try to find a middle ground that doesn't exist? There is no easy answer, and judging Ellen Patton's decision from a distance is not the same as being in her position. But her choice stands as a reminder that justice often depends on individuals being willing to make decisions that hurt them personally. The physical evidence in the Miller case, though not central to the arrest, is worth examining. In 1984, the forensic tools available to investigators were limited. Blood typing could narrow down suspects but not identify them definitively. Fingerprints were useful only if they matched someone already in the system. Hair and fiber analysis required painstaking work and often produced inconclusive results. Detectives did collect biological evidence from the crime scene, samples that were preserved and stored according to the protocols of the time, but without a suspect to compare them to, that evidence sat unused for years. When Michael Patton was arrested in 2010, investigators sent the preserved samples for DNA testing. The results confirmed what Patton had already admitted: his DNA was present at the scene. This confirmation was important for legal purposes, as it provided objective corroboration of his confession, but it did not change the fundamental fact that the case had been solved by human action, not scientific discovery. The DNA analysis came after the arrest, not before. It supported the case but did not crack it. This distinction is significant because it highlights the limitations of relying solely on technology to solve cold cases. DNA databases, advanced forensic techniques, and digital tools are valuable, but they are not magic. They work best when there is something to compare, when suspects are identified through other means, when investigators have a starting point. In cases where no suspect has ever been seriously considered, where evidence sits in storage with no name attached to it, technology alone cannot provide answers. It requires human intelligence, human courage, and often human failure or confession to move forward. The Miller case also serves as a reminder that cold cases are not always solved because someone decides to reopen the file and take a fresh look. Sometimes they are solved because circumstances outside the control of investigators create opportunities that didn't exist before. A marriage falls apart. A conscience becomes unbearable. A lie collapses under its own weight. These are not investigative techniques that can be taught or replicated, but they are realities that shape how justice happens in the real world. For the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, the resolution of the Miller case was both a relief and a reminder of how much depends on factors investigators cannot control. Detectives had done everything they could in 1984 with the tools and knowledge available to them. They had interviewed extensively, processed evidence carefully, and followed leads until there were none left to follow. The case went cold not because of negligence or incompetence, but because without new information, there was nowhere left to go. When that new information finally arrived in 2010, investigators acted swiftly and professionally, securing a confession and building a case that led to a guilty plea. But the breakthrough came from outside their efforts, from a woman who walked into their office and said her husband had told her something she couldn't keep to herself. This is how many cold cases are solved. Not through dogged determination alone, though determination matters. Not through scientific innovation alone, though science helps. But through a combination of persistence, luck, time, and the unpredictable behavior of human beings who carry secrets that eventually become too heavy to hold. Richard Miller never gave extensive interviews about the case. He spoke briefly to reporters after Michael Patton's sentencing, saying only that he was grateful for the truth and that he hoped his daughters could finally rest in peace. Those who knew him said he seemed different after the arrest, not happier exactly, but less burdened. For 26 years, he had lived in a state of limbo, not knowing whether his daughter's killer was alive or dead, whether justice would ever come, whether anyone besides him still cared. The arrest and conviction provided an ending to that uncertainty. It didn't erase the pain or bring his daughters back, but it gave him something he hadn't had for most of his adult life, an answer. In the final years of his life, Richard established a small scholarship fund in Barbara and Susan's names. The fund supported nursing students and aspiring writers, honoring the paths his daughters had hoped to follow. He attended the scholarship ceremonies when he was able, shaking hands with young people who had never heard of the Miller sisters but who were carrying forward the dreams those sisters never got to fulfill. It was a quiet form of legacy, one that didn't involve headlines or public attention, but it mattered to Richard, and in its own way, it mattered to the community. The town of Castle Rock has changed significantly since 1984. The population has grown. The landscape has developed. The small-town atmosphere that once defined the area has given way to suburban sprawl and the pressures of proximity to Denver. Most residents today were not living there in 1984 and have no personal memory of Barbara and Susan Miller. But for those who do remember, the case remains a defining event, a marker of before and after, a reminder that tragedy can strike anywhere and that justice, when it comes, does not always arrive in time to heal the wounds it addresses. There is a memorial bench in a park on the east side of town, placed there by the Miller family in the years after the murders. It bears a small plaque with Barbara and Susan's names and the dates of their births and deaths. For a long time, that bench was one of the few public acknowledgments that they had existed. After Michael Patton's conviction, the town added a second plaque with a brief inscription, "Truth found. Justice served. Never forgotten." It is a simple statement, almost understated, but it captures the essence of what the case ultimately became, a story about the long road to truth and the value of remembering. The psychological impact of the case on the broader community is harder to quantify. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Castle Rock experienced a collective sense of fear and vulnerability. Parents kept their children closer. People locked their doors. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. Over time, as the case went cold and daily life resumed, that acute fear faded, but it left behind a residue of unease. The knowledge that the killer had never been caught meant that safety could never be fully restored. When Michael Patton was arrested in 2010, that unease was replaced by a different kind of discomfort, the realization that the threat had been living among them all along. This revelation forced people to reconsider their assumptions about safety and familiarity. The man who had seemed harmless, who had been part of the community for decades, had been hiding a monstrous act. It raised questions about who else might be hiding similar secrets, what other dangers might be lurking beneath the surface of ordinary life. These are questions without satisfying answers, and they linger long after the specific case is resolved. One of the more difficult aspects of the Miller case is understanding Michael Patton's motivations and psychological state. His confession provided details about what happened but did not fully explain why. He described an impulsive decision to visit Barbara Miller, a fixation that had no basis in any real relationship, and a violent escalation driven by panic and a desire to avoid consequences. But these explanations, while factually accurate, do not provide insight into the deeper psychological mechanisms that allowed him to commit such an act and then live with it for 26 years. Forensic psychologists who have studied similar cases point to a combination of factors that can contribute to this kind of behavior. Impulsivity, poor emotional regulation, a sense of entitlement or possessiveness toward women, and an inability to cope with rejection are all common elements. In Patton's case, there was also evidence of long-term emotional suppression and avoidance. He did not seek therapy or confide in anyone about what he had done. He attempted to bury it completely, to live as though it had never happened, and that strategy worked for a long time. But psychological burdens do not simply disappear. They manifest in other ways: nightmares, substance use, emotional distance, relationship problems, and eventually, the weight becomes unbearable. Ellen Patton's decision to report her husband suggests that she recognized he was not the person she thought she had married. The man who confessed to her in early 2010 was, in some fundamental way, a stranger. She had lived with him for more than 2 decades, raised children with him, built a life with him, and yet the core of who he was had been hidden from her. That kind of betrayal is difficult to process, and it speaks to the broader theme of how well we can ever truly know another person. The impact on Patton's children is another layer of tragedy in this case. They grew up with a father who, by all outward appearances, was ordinary. They had no reason to suspect anything was wrong beyond the typical struggles of a family dealing with personal issues. When they learned the truth about their father, their understanding of their own lives was fundamentally altered. Their childhoods, their memories, their sense of identity, all of it was recontextualized in light of this new information. They had to grapple with the fact that their father was responsible for the deaths of 2 young women, that their very existence was intertwined with a crime that had devastated another family. This is a form of trauma that is rarely discussed in the context of criminal cases. The families of offenders, particularly the children, are often overlooked victims in their own right. They did nothing wrong, yet they inherit shame, stigma, and emotional damage that can last a lifetime. In the Miller case, Patton's children lost their father not to death or distance, but to the revelation of who he truly was. They lost their innocence, their sense of security, and their place in the community. They were forced to leave Colorado and start over under different names, carrying a secret of their own, not what they had done, but what their father had done and what that meant for who they were. The question of whether Michael Patton deserves any sympathy is one that divides opinion. Some argue that his suffering, his inability to escape his own guilt, and his eventual confession demonstrate a capacity for remorse that should be acknowledged, even if it does not excuse his actions. Others argue that any suffering he experienced was a direct result of his own choices, and that extending sympathy toward him minimizes the suffering of his victims and their family. Both perspectives have merit, and the tension between them reflects broader debates about justice, punishment, and the possibility of redemption. What is clear is that Michael Patton destroyed multiple lives, including his own. Barbara and Susan Miller lost their futures. Richard and Joyce Miller lost their daughters and spent decades in a state of unresolved grief. Ellen Patton and her children lost the life they thought they had. The community lost its sense of safety and trust. And Michael Patton himself lost whatever humanity he might have claimed before the morning of June 14, 1984. In choosing violence, in choosing to prioritize his own panic over the lives of 2 young women, he set in motion a chain of destruction that touched everyone connected to the case. The legal outcome of the case, 2 life sentences without parole, ensures that Patton will never be free again. He is now in his 60s, serving his time in a Colorado state prison. He has had no contact with his children since his arrest. He has not given interviews or made public statements beyond his brief apology at sentencing. He exists in a kind of enforced silence, removed from the world he once inhabited, left to spend the remainder of his life reflecting on what he did and what it cost. For some, this outcome represents justice. Patton is behind bars. He cannot hurt anyone else. He is being punished for his crimes in a tangible, concrete way. For others, the outcome feels insufficient. No amount of prison time can restore what was taken. No punishment can undo the past or compensate for the decades of suffering his actions caused. Justice, in this sense, is incomplete and always will be. The role of Ellen Patton in bringing the case to resolution cannot be overstated. Her decision to go to the police was not inevitable. Many people in her position would have struggled with the implications of turning in a spouse, would have questioned whether they had heard correctly, would have feared the consequences for themselves and their children. Ellen chose to act despite those fears. She chose accountability over self-preservation. That choice is what made justice possible. In the single interview she gave after her husband's sentencing, Ellen was asked whether she regretted coming forward. She paused for a long time before answering. She said she regretted the circumstances that put her in that position. She regretted that her husband had done what he did and that he had hidden it from her for so long. But she did not regret going to the police. She said that Barbara and Susan Miller deserved to have someone speak for them, and if she could do that, if she could provide the information that led to justice, then she had an obligation to do so, no matter how painful it was for her personally. This kind of moral clarity is rare. It is easy to talk about doing the right thing in abstract terms, but it is much harder to follow through when the cost is high and the consequences are real. Ellen Patton demonstrated that kind of courage, and it is worth recognizing and honoring that. She did not commit the crime, but she bore part of the burden of resolving it, and she did so knowing it would destroy the life she had built. The question of why Michael Patton chose to confess to his wife after 26 years of silence is one that may never have a satisfying answer. In his confession to police, he described feeling trapped, exhausted, and unable to continue living with the weight of what he had done. He said the secret had poisoned everything in his life, that he couldn't be present with his family or enjoy anything because the knowledge of what he had done was always there, just beneath the surface. He said he told Ellen because he couldn't carry it anymore and because, on some level, he wanted to be caught. He wanted the pretending to be over. This explanation suggests that guilt, over time, became its own form of pressure. Patton was not living freely for those 26 years. He was living in a prison of his own making, one that followed him everywhere and intruded on every moment. The physical freedom he enjoyed, the ability to go to work, raise children, participate in community life, was undermined by the psychological captivity of his secret. Eventually, that internal pressure exceeded his ability to maintain the facade, and he broke. There is a certain tragic irony in this. Michael Patton's confession, the act that led to his imprisonment, was also the thing that released him from the psychological torment he had been enduring. In admitting what he had done, he transferred the burden from his own mind to the legal system. He no longer had to pretend. He no longer had to fear discovery. The worst had happened, and in a perverse way, that brought a kind of relief. But this relief came at the expense of others. His confession destroyed his wife's sense of reality, traumatized his children, and reopened wounds for the Miller family that had never fully healed. Whatever release Michael Patton experienced by telling the truth was purchased with the suffering of people who had already been victimized by his actions, either directly or indirectly. The investigation that followed Ellen Patton's report was methodical and thorough. Detectives revisited the original case file, comparing Michael Patton's 1984 statements with the details he had provided in his confession to his wife. There were inconsistencies, small lies that had gone unnoticed at the time but that became significant in light of the new information. For example, Patton had told detectives in 1984 that he had walked past the Miller house but had not stopped. In his 2010 confession, he admitted he had gone inside. He had told detectives he barely knew the Miller sisters. In his confession, he admitted to a fixation on Barbara that had lasted for months. These discrepancies, combined with the physical evidence that had been preserved since 1984, allowed detectives to build a case that went beyond Ellen's testimony. They had the original crime scene photographs, the forensic samples, the witness statements, and now a detailed confession that explained how and why the murders had occurred. When DNA testing confirmed that biological evidence from the scene matched Michael Patton's profile, the case became nearly airtight. The decision to charge Patton with second-degree murder rather than first-degree murder was strategic. First-degree murder requires proof of premeditation, a deliberate plan to kill. Patton's confession described an impulsive visit that escalated into violence, which better fit the legal definition of second-degree murder. The prosecution could have pursued first-degree charges, but the risk of a trial and the possibility of an acquittal on the higher charge made the plea agreement the safer option. Patton's willingness to plead guilty and accept life sentences removed the need for a trial, spared the Miller family the trauma of reliving the details in court, and ensured that justice would be served. From a legal standpoint, the case was a success. A confession was obtained, charges were filed, a guilty plea was entered, and a sentence was imposed that ensured the offender would never be free. But from a human standpoint, the case was a reminder of how much damage one person can cause and how long the consequences of that damage can last. Richard Miller attended every court hearing related to Michael Patton's case. He sat in the front row, his face expressionless, his hands folded in his lap. He did not speak to Patton. He did not look at him directly. He simply bore witness to the process, ensuring that someone who loved Barbara and Susan was present to represent them. After the sentencing, Richard was approached by a reporter who asked how he felt. He said he felt old. He said he felt tired. He said he was glad it was over, but that over didn't mean what people thought it meant. His daughters were still gone. His wife had died without knowing the truth. The years of not knowing could not be given back to him. Justice had been served, but it was justice that arrived too late to heal the deepest wounds. This is the reality of cold cases. Even when they are solved, even when the person responsible is held accountable, the resolution does not erase the past. It does not undo the loss or restore what was taken. It provides an answer, a name, a measure of accountability, but it does not provide wholeness. The families of victims learn to live with this incomplete justice because it is the best that the world can offer, and because the alternative, living without any answers at all, is worse. In the years since Michael Patton's conviction, there have been efforts to improve how law enforcement handles cold cases. Advances in DNA technology have made it possible to re-examine evidence from decades-old crimes and identify suspects who were never previously considered. Databases that allow for genetic genealogy searches have revolutionized the field, leading to the resolution of cases that once seemed impossible to solve. But these tools are not equally effective in all cases, and they come with their own ethical and legal challenges. The Miller case, because it was solved through confession rather than forensic innovation, serves as a reminder that technology is only one part of the equation. Human behavior, human relationships, and human choices remain central to how justice happens. In some cases, no amount of scientific advancement will matter if the person responsible never enters the system, never leaves biological evidence, or never makes a mistake that connects them to the crime. In those cases, resolution depends on people, witnesses who come forward, insiders who break silence, or offenders who confess. This is not to diminish the value of forensic science or technological tools. They have solved countless cases and will continue to do so. But it is important to recognize that they are not a panacea, and that the complexities of human psychology and behavior will always play a role in how crimes are committed, investigated, and ultimately resolved. For families waiting for answers in cold cases, the Miller case offers both hope and caution. Hope, because it demonstrates that cases can be solved even after decades of inactivity. Caution, because it also demonstrates how much depends on circumstances outside anyone's control. If Michael Patton had not married, if his marriage had not deteriorated, if he had not chosen to confess to his wife, if Ellen Patton had not chosen to go to the police, any one of those factors being different could have meant the case remained unsolved. The fact that justice happened at all was, in some sense, a matter of chance as much as effort. This randomness is difficult to accept, particularly for families who are still waiting. They want to believe that persistence and dedication will eventually yield results, that if they keep pushing, keep asking, keep hoping, the truth will eventually emerge. And sometimes that is true. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes cases remain unsolved not because of negligence or incompetence, but because the circumstances that would allow for resolution never materialize. This is a harsh reality, and it underscores the importance of supporting cold case investigations, funding forensic advancements, and creating systems that give families the best possible chance of finding answers, even when those answers are not guaranteed. The Miller family's experience also highlights the emotional toll of living in a state of unresolved grief. Richard Miller spent 26 years not knowing who had killed his daughters. Every day during that time, he carried the weight of unanswered questions. Every time he saw a news story about a solved case, he wondered if his daughter's case would be next. Every time the phone rang, he wondered if it was the call he had been waiting for. That kind of sustained uncertainty takes a toll that is difficult to measure or quantify. It affects mental health, physical health, relationships, and quality of life. When the case was finally solved, Richard experienced relief, but he also experienced the realization of how much time had been lost, how much of his life had been consumed by waiting, and how much his wife had missed by dying before the truth was known. There is also the broader social question of how communities deal with violence and the revelation that someone they trusted was responsible. In Castle Rock, the reaction to Michael Patton's arrest was multifaceted. Some people were shocked, unable to reconcile the person they knew with the person described in news reports. Others claimed they had always sensed something was off about him, though there is little evidence that anyone had serious suspicions before his confession. This kind of retrospective reinterpretation is common in cases like this. Once the truth is revealed, people look back through a new lens and find patterns or signs that seem obvious in hindsight but were not visible at the time. This phenomenon speaks to a psychological need to make sense of the incomprehensible. If Michael Patton had been visibly dangerous, if he had exhibited clear warning signs, then his neighbors could reassure themselves that they would have recognized the threat. But the reality is that he was ordinary, unremarkable, someone who blended into the fabric of daily life. Accepting that fact means accepting that danger can be invisible, that people are capable of hiding terrible things, and that the world is less predictable and less safe than we would like to believe. For some residents of Castle Rock, Michael Patton's arrest and conviction provided a sense of closure. The mystery was solved. The person responsible was behind bars. Life could move forward. For others, the resolution raised more questions than it answered. How had he managed to hide his guilt for so long? Were there other things he had done that no one knew about? Could this happen again? These questions do not have easy answers, and they reflect the deeper anxieties that cases like this evoke. The physical spaces associated with the case, the Miller home, the streets where Patton walked, the hardware store where he worked, became sites of painful memory. Some people avoided them. Others visited them out of morbid curiosity. The house where Barbara and Susan died changed hands several times over the years. Each new owner had to decide whether to disclose the property's history to neighbors and guests. Some did. Some didn't. Eventually, the house was demolished and a new structure built in its place, as though erasing the physical space could somehow erase the memory of what had happened there. But memory does not work that way. The people who lived through the original crime, who attended the vigils, who watched Richard Miller age without answers, carry those memories regardless of whether the physical structures remain. And those memories are part of the community's collective history, shaping how Castle Rock understands itself and its past. The memorial bench in the park remains one of the most enduring symbols of Barbara and Susan Miller's legacy. It is a quiet place, often empty, but occasionally visited by people who remember the sisters or who have learned about the case and want to pay their respects. The bench sits beneath a tree, facing east toward the mountains, and the plaques mounted on its back tell a story in just a few words: 2 names, 2 sets of dates, and the simple declaration that truth was found and justice served. For Richard Miller, that bench was one of the few places where he felt close to his daughters after they were gone. He visited it regularly, sometimes sitting for hours, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just standing quietly before walking away. After Michael Patton's conviction, Richard visited the bench one final time before the second plaque was added. He placed a photograph of Barbara and Susan on the seat, both of them smiling, both of them young and alive and full of promise. He stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, his face turned toward the mountains. Then he picked up the photograph, folded it carefully, and walked back to his car. The broader implications of the Miller case extend into discussions about memory, trauma, and the passage of time. 26 years is more than a quarter of a century. It is long enough for children to be born and grow into adults. It is long enough for technologies to be invented, for social norms to shift, for entire landscapes to change. It is long enough for some people to forget and others to be consumed by the act of remembering. For Richard Miller, those 26 years were defined by absence. The absence of his daughters, the absence of answers, the absence of closure. He measured his life in terms of before and the after stretched on far longer than the before. By the time justice arrived, he was an old man, physically frail, emotionally exhausted, and painfully aware that the resolution he had fought for could not restore what had been lost. But he was also able to die knowing the truth, and for him, that knowledge mattered. For Michael Patton, those same 26 years were defined by concealment and fear. He built a life on a foundation of lies, and that foundation was always unstable, always threatening to collapse. The nightmares, the drinking, the emotional distance, all of it was a manifestation of the secret he was carrying. He lived in a constant state of low-level dread, waiting for the moment when someone would knock on his door and say they knew what he had done. That moment came eventually, but it came from within his own home, from his own confession, from his own inability to continue pretending. The psychological concept of moral injury is relevant here. Moral injury refers to the damage that occurs when someone violates their own moral code or witnesses violations that deeply conflict with their values. It is distinct from trauma in that it involves guilt, shame, and a sense of betrayal, either of oneself or by others. Michael Patton's psychological state during those 26 years likely involved elements of moral injury. He knew what he had done was wrong. He knew it had destroyed innocent lives. And he had to live with that knowledge every day, with no outlet, no confession, no absolution. This does not excuse his actions or elicit sympathy, but it does help explain the psychological toll that secrets and guilt can exact over time. It also raises questions about whether true psychological freedom is possible for people living with unconfessed crimes. Some researchers argue that the act of confession, even when it leads to punishment, provides a kind of psychological relief that can be more powerful than the fear of consequences. Michael Patton's eventual confession supports this theory. He chose to tell the truth even though he knew it would result in his imprisonment, suggesting that the need to unburden himself outweighed his desire to remain free. The impact on the broader criminal justice system is also worth considering. The Miller case demonstrated that cold cases can be solved through non-forensic means, but it also highlighted how dependent such resolutions are on unpredictable human factors. Law enforcement agencies cannot plan for or rely on confessions that come decades after the crime. They cannot assume that offenders will eventually break under the weight of their guilt. What they can do is maintain thorough records, preserve evidence properly, and remain open to new information regardless of how much time has passed. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office handled the case professionally from beginning to end. In 1984, they conducted a thorough investigation with the tools available to them. In 2010, when new information became available, they acted quickly and effectively. The fact that the case went cold for 26 years was not a failure of effort or competence, it was a reflection of the limitations inherent in investigating crimes where the perpetrator remains unknown and undetected. There is a philosophical dimension to the Miller case that touches on questions of justice, time, and the possibility of redemption. Is justice that arrives 26 years late still justice? Does the passage of time diminish the moral weight of a crime, or does it amplify it? Can someone who has lived a seemingly normal life for decades still be held accountable for something they did in the past? These are not abstract questions. They have real implications for how we think about punishment, forgiveness, and the purpose of the criminal justice system. Some argue that Michael Patton should be judged not only for what he did in 1984, but also for the 26 years of deception that followed. He chose, every single day, to hide the truth. He chose to let Barbara and Susan Miller's family suffer without answers. He chose to prioritize his own freedom and comfort over accountability. In this view, the length of time that passed makes his crimes worse, not better. Others might argue that Michael Patton did experience a form of punishment during those years, that his psychological suffering constituted a kind of justice even if it was internal and invisible. This view does not excuse his actions or suggest that legal punishment was unnecessary, but it acknowledges that guilt can be a powerful and destructive force, one that exacts a toll regardless of whether the law intervenes. The tension between these perspectives reflects broader debates about the purpose of punishment. Is it meant to deter future crimes? To incapacitate dangerous individuals? To provide retribution for victims? To rehabilitate offenders? Or is it simply meant to affirm societal values and demonstrate that certain actions will not be tolerated? In Michael Patton's case, the punishment served multiple purposes. It incapacitated him by ensuring he could never harm anyone else. It provided a measure of retribution for the Miller family. And it affirmed the principle that murder, no matter how much time has passed, will be met with accountability. But the question of whether it provided justice in a deeper, more meaningful sense remains open. Richard Miller said that the conviction gave him answers but did not bring peace. That distinction is important. Answers are factual. They tell you what happened and who was responsible. Peace is emotional and spiritual. It requires a sense of wholeness, resolution, and acceptance that cannot be legislated or imposed. For many families of murder victims, peace never comes, regardless of whether the case is solved. The wound is too deep, the loss too profound. The idea of closure, often invoked in discussions of criminal justice, is itself a contested concept. Some victim advocates argue that closure is a myth, that it implies a neat ending that does not reflect the reality of grief and trauma. Others argue that closure, properly understood, does not mean forgetting or moving on, but rather reaching a point where the loss can be integrated into one's life without dominating every moment. In this sense, Richard Miller may have achieved a form of closure after Michael Patton's conviction. He knew the truth. He had seen the person responsible held accountable. He could spend the remainder of his life without the torment of unanswered questions. But his daughters were still gone, and that absence would shape his life until the day he died. The role of media in the Miller case was relatively limited, which is noteworthy in itself. The murders in 1984 received significant local coverage, as one would expect, but the case did not become a national story. There were no high-profile documentaries, no true crime podcasts, no books written about the case. It remained a local tragedy, known primarily to the people of Castle Rock and Douglas County. This changed somewhat after Michael Patton's arrest in 2010, when the case received renewed attention due to the long delay between the crime and the resolution. But even then, the coverage was measured and respectful, focusing on the facts rather than sensationalizing the details. This restraint is worth acknowledging. In an era when true crime content has become a major genre in entertainment, with podcasts, television series, and online forums dedicated to dissecting unsolved cases, the Miller family was largely spared the invasive scrutiny that many victims' families experience. They were able to grieve privately, to pursue justice without the added pressure of public attention, and to control how their daughters were remembered. The ethical questions surrounding true crime media are complex. On one hand, public interest in unsolved cases can generate new leads, keep pressure on law enforcement, and ensure that victims are not forgotten. On the other hand, it can turn tragedy into entertainment, exploit grief for profit, and invade the privacy of people who are already suffering. The Miller case, because it remained relatively obscure, avoided many of these pitfalls. The family was able to maintain dignity and control over their own narrative, which is not always possible in high-profile cases. The question of how to tell these stories responsibly is one that anyone engaged in true crime storytelling must grapple with. There is value in remembering victims, in honoring their lives, and in examining the circumstances that led to their deaths. But there is also a risk of reducing them to plot points, of focusing more on the killer than the killed, of treating real human suffering as material for consumption. The balance is delicate, and it requires constant attention to the humanity of everyone involved. In the case of Barbara and Susan Miller, their story is not primarily about Michael Patton. It is about two young women who had futures full of possibility, about parents who loved them and fought for them, about a community that was changed by their loss, and about the long, difficult process of seeking justice when the odds seem insurmountable. Michael Patton is part of that story, but he is not the center of it. The center is the absence created when Barbara and Susan were killed, and the decades-long effort to fill that absence with truth and accountability. As I said at the beginning, what finally brought that truth to light was something human, something fragile, something that could easily have never happened. A marriage fell apart. A man confessed. A woman made a choice. And because of that chain of events, a case that had been cold for 26 years was solved. Justice arrived late, incomplete, and insufficient to heal all wounds, but it arrived. And for Richard Miller, for the memory of Barbara and Susan, and for the principle that truth matters even when it takes decades to emerge, that outcome was worth fighting for. If you stay to the end, you're someone who wants to understand what really happens when the truth is buried for decades and when justice depends on choices no one can predict. That kind of curiosity is rare. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. Rest in peace, Barbara Miller. Rest in peace, Susan Miller. Your lives mattered. Your story matters. And the 26 years it took to find the truth do not diminish the fact that truth, however late, was finally spoken. I'll see you in the next one.